Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is the annual NBA GM survey episode. We'll go through the NBA.com GM survey. How many Timberwolves mentions were there? Which players were not mentioned at all? And which categories were the Wolves somehow not included in? Some curious answers from the GMs, but a strong showing by the Timberwolves in the GM survey. We're going to get to it all today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy Timberwolves preseason game day. And a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. And, of course, you can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with two B's, two E's. CKEN. Also a reminder that Locked On Wolves, along with all of our other Locked On Minnesota podcasts, are now available on our own app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. It's part of Locked On Sports Minnesota. You can find the Locked On Sports Minnesota app there. More great local sports coverage 24/7. It's absolutely free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can listen to all of our fantastic Locked On Minnesota pods there. All right, so the Wolves do play the Lakers tonight in Las Vegas. And not a whole lot to say about that in terms of previewing the game. We're not sure yet who's playing, who's not. There has, as of this recording, the Timberwolves haven't ruled anybody out publicly. It would be a shock if Karl-Anthony Towns played, given that he just started practicing 3 days ago. But who knows on D'Lo and Rudy Gobert? It's always a possibility that one of those guys sees the floor. We just don't know yet as of this recording. So we'll find out more Thursday night. And then yeah, I mean, today is really the NBA GM survey show, which is one of my favorites of the year. I think this is a really fun exercise. There's been 21 of them. They've done it at NBA.com, and they talk to all 30 decision makers and, ask a number of interesting questions. And the Timberwolves are perennially one of they could be a breakout team. They've got one of the best young cores. Karl-Anthony Towns had started a team with Cat. That was only like 4 years ago. GMs voted him as the number one player to start a team with. And, there's been a lot of Wolves appearances. It's taken an entirely different tone this year. So there's a couple ways to attack this, but what I'd like to do is kind of go through and talk about where the Wolves as a team were mentioned, then talk about where certain players were mentioned, and then obviously other players, non-Wolves players that, ranked in these same categories. And then also a couple of categories that I was really surprised that the Wolves somehow weren't mentioned in, or at least I was surprised about the teams that were mentioned in, and just, how that ended up shaking out. So we'll start with the Wolves as a team. Each year, part of the survey is what will the finish be in the standings in each conference. So in the Western Conference this year, the rankings based on voting from the GMs, they rank everybody, I think 1 through 9. Or I guess, yeah, that must be how they do it. The Clippers are actually tied with Golden State, but the Clippers receive more second place votes. So the Clippers are in first. Golden State's really interesting. They're second on this list with 48% first place votes, but they also had votes as low as fourth, and had teams that ranked them even lower, or had GMs that ranked them even lower, because they had a much lower second place and third place total than the Clippers. But at any rate, the Clippers are first, Golden State is second, Phoenix third. They're the only other team to receive any first place votes. Denver fourth, Memphis fifth, and Minnesota and Dallas tied for sixth. Now, one other interesting note, Minnesota did receive a vote for third place. Dallas did not. Golden State didn't receive any third place votes. They only received first, second, fourth, and lower. So the Wolves were one of only 5 teams to receive third place votes in the West. They received 7% fourth place votes, and pretty much everybody else obviously had them lower than that. So they tied with Dallas for 6th. Of course, Dallas ends up having a phenomenal season last year, but with the loss of Jalen Brunson and some of their curious offseason moves, I think a lot of people believe Minnesota will be better than them. I think it's interesting that they're so distantly behind Memphis. I think it's interesting that Phoenix and Denver both have so much support in that second and third voting, second to fourth voting. I'd probably, again, I haven't made my official predictions, but I'd probably slide in Minnesota at this point ahead of Denver, maybe right behind Phoenix at fourth, and also ahead of Memphis. Um, that's where I think we'll end up. I don't necessarily think that, like, sitting here right now, I'm going to make the argument that Minnesota's a better team roster. They'll be better, opening night than Denver or Memphis. But I think by the end of the season, that's where we'll be. For some context here, last season, 80% of the people in this poll picked the Los Angeles Lakers to win the Western Conference. Now, obviously, there were injury issues. But, I think I probably did say at the time how crazy it was that people thought the Russell Westbrook thing would work out, because it turns out he hasn't been good in a little while, and that just was never gonna work. And there were plenty of issues at play for the Lakers, but to have 80% of GMs pick them to win the West last year, I just can't believe that, considering the fact that nobody got more than 48% of the vote this year. Incidentally, the order last season in the polling was Lakers, Utah, Phoenix, which aren't far off, Denver, which obviously had more injury issues and finished lower than people thought, Golden State, which I had Golden State a little bit lower than that. This poll had them fifth, and clearly they were better than that. The Clippers, Dallas, and Portland. So overall, not terrible. Obviously, way overselling the Lakers, slightly overselling, a couple other teams in there, underselling Golden State, way overselling Portland. Obviously, the Damian Lillard injury changed things drastically for them. But this poll isn't exactly, these guys may be GMs, but if they all had a crystal ball, then they would all win the title every year, right? So um, it's an interesting exercise. But at any rate, the Wolves are tied for sixth. The other team highlights here is that the Wolves were tied for second in best overall offseason moves, which I, I'm actually a little bit surprised that they ranked that well in that particular category, because of all the. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The media should be surprised they ranked that well, because the narrative is, oh, team. I mean, you hear Brian Windhorst on ESPN, and obviously some of what Brian does is great, but he's not the only one, so I shouldn't call him out. But there's a handful of media people that are like, oh, GMs can't believe how much the Timberwolves gave up. Well, I mean, they tied for second in this poll, 17%. I believe, if my math is correct, that means 5 or 6 different GMs voted them as the best overall moves this offseason. Not as I can't believe they gave up so many picks. Not that's 5 or 6. So, 20% of the GMs in the league. No, that's terrible math. Whatever it is, more than that, percent of GMs in the league think that the Wolves had the best overall moves this offseason. The Cavs got 41%, were easily first. I get that. I think Donovan Mitchell overall, I've talked about this before, is a bit overrated in terms of what he actually supplies. He fits that roster well, and they also made some good ancillary moves. So I get it. The Wolves were tied for second with the Sixers and the Jazz. And the only other teams that received votes were the Celtics, who I believe won this last year. Oh, no, sorry, the Heat won this last year. And then the Sacramento Kings also got some votes. But the point here is that this narrative that everybody thinks the Wolves are insane and they ruined it for everybody because they gave up so many picks, they don't know what they're doing. Well, there's at least 5 or 6 GMs that don't think that, plus the Wolves, right? So, I mean, you're talking a pretty good chunk of the league that would co-sign this as not just an okay offseason, not just, a reasonable investment into Rudy Gobert, but the best offseason in the NBA. So let's not lose sight of how of that, angle here, I guess. Related to that, the Timberwolves are also listed as the 4th most improved team, which is I think a similar question. Or I guess the question is, which team will be most improved this year? So the Clippers won because obviously Paul George, Kawhi Leonard healthy. Okay, sure. The Cavs and Pelicans tied for second. I don't know about. I mean, I guess I could buy both those. Obviously, with the Pelicans, it's about a full season of McCollum and obviously a healthy Zion. The Timberwolves are 4th with 10%. Other teams receiving votes: the Nets, Pistons, Blazers, and Kings. If the question is most improved, I wouldn't vote for the Wolves as most improved, because that makes me think who wins the most, who improves their win total the most. I mean, I think the Clippers and Cavs and Pelicans are all better options than the Timberwolves. I think the Wolves will ultimately, because the Wolves won 46 games last year. I mean, they may win 10 more games, but the Clippers, I mean, if those guys are reasonably healthy, that could be 12, 15 games improvement. I think the Wolves are certainly in the conversation, but if I were, if we were betting on this, the odds at Bet Online would not be, all that favorable for the Wolves because they already were a pretty good team last year. They had a better record than the Clippers, the Cavs, and the Pelicans last season. So it wouldn't, it wouldn't make a ton of sense. At any rate, a couple more team things to get to, and then we'll get on to the player stuff. First, though, let's talk about some of our very best friends over at betonline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. Tons of great football this weekend, college Saturday, NFL Sunday. The London game again Sunday morning. The Vikings had it last week. This week it's the Packers. So a ton of games to bet on over at BetOnline. That has to be where you go for all your football betting. And also win totals for the NBA season. We're a couple of weeks out now from actually less than 2 weeks from the Timberwolves regular season opener. So, I mean, if you're going to get on win totals, now's the time to do it. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information. With live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, golf, and more. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, continuing on the NBA survey. First, though, once again, I thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. And a reminder to check out the Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview starting October 10th. That's this coming Monday. A 6-episode extravaganza to get you ready for the NBA season. The local team experts and the NBA insiders of the Locked On Podcast Network and Odyssey all combined into one Ultimate NBA Preview starting Monday, the 10th, this coming Monday. Search for Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview 2022 on your Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay. So the Timberwolves were tied for 6th in the West in the rankings. They did receive a vote for 3rd. They were tied for 2nd in best overall offseason moves and 4th in most improved. They were also tied for 4th in level of success toughest to predict. I'll read the exact, verbiage here in a second. Which team's level of success this season is toughest to predict? The Timberwolves were tied for 4th. Brooklyn, number 1 at 32%. That's who I would have voted for. The Lakers, 2nd at 18%. I get that. Memphis, 3rd at 14%. I think that's a little less difficult, right? I think it'll be pretty similar, maybe a little bit worse, right? I mean, is Ja really going to take another leap? No Jaren Jackson for at least a third of the season, if not half of the season. D'Anthony Melton, Kyle Anderson moving on. I think it's going to be a similar season, probably a little bit worse. I don't think that's that hard to predict. And then tied for 4th, the Chicago Bulls, the Timberwolves, the Pelicans, and also the Sixers. Others receiving votes, the Clippers and Blazers. I get the Wolves there. I don't think it's that hard. I mean, as somebody who covers the team to predict what's going to happen, I think the regular season they're going to win 50 to 55 games. Again, I'll put a finer point on that later. I think they'll be a top 4 seed in the West. I think they'll be really good. I think they'll probably win in the first round of the playoffs. I actually don't think that the range of outcomes this season is all that broad for the Wolves, believe it or not. I think that the floor is basically a little better than where they were last year, barring catastrophic injury, knock on wood. And the ceiling is probably maybe the 3rd seed in the West and maybe a conference finals type, berth. Like, I think it's a relatively narrow path. Last year, you could have told me any number of things and you could have talked me into it. This year, I feel like, hey, I mean, I guess if Ant takes like a leap, like beyond even what Ja did from year 2 to 3, then who knows? I mean, this guy really is the limit this year for the Wolves. I tend to think that it's another year before that happens, but hopefully I'm wrong. I think I would not have listed them under toughest to predict in terms of season result. The last team mentioned was number 1 in most surprising move, which should not be surprising to us that is the case. That's the Rudy Gobert acquisition. I was a little surprised that it only got 47% of the vote. So only of the 15 GMs or the 30 GMs, that means 14 of them voted Gobert to Minnesota as the most surprising move. Donovan Mitchell to Cleveland was 2nd, which sure, 43%. And then a couple of votes for DeJounte Murray to Atlanta and 1 for Drummond to Chicago. Which is, I guess, maybe if the GMs in Cleveland and Minnesota couldn't vote for their own moves, which is possible, then I guess that means one other GM voted for the Murray one, and one of the either Minnesota or Cleveland voted for Murray or Drummond as the most surprising moves. Doesn't matter. It's just weird. Okay. Moving on to player mentions. and coach, I should say, players and coach. Anthony Edwards was listed as tied for second for having a breakout year this season. Um, that's not a surprise. That makes a ton of sense to me that he would be listed there. Tied for second with Cade Cunningham, next behind Evan Mobley, number one. I think Mobley and Edwards, I mentioned this actually on the Odyssey Roundtable that's going to go up next week. I was in the On the Rise Odyssey Roundtable with various Locked On Cavs, actually. So we talked a little bit about Mobley, Locked On Raptors. We talked about Scotty Barnes. And I talked about how I think Edwards and Mobley, and also Scotty Barnes, but especially Edwards and Mobley, are kind of on that same trajectory where everybody kind of has them in like, hey, they're both kind of in that 20th to 30th best player. They're borderline all-stars, but their ceiling is like maybe top 3 player in the league, right? That's how everybody seems to feel about both Evan Mobley and Anthony Edwards. So I buy both of them being there in this. So Mobley got one more vote than Edwards, first with 21%. Edwards tied with Cade at second with 17%. I would say both Mobley and Edwards over Cade simply because the infrastructure is there with those teams more so than it is for Detroit. A bit more continuity. I think Detroit certainly improved their roster this offseason, but I don't think there's enough around Cade for him like yet. There's some nice young talent, but I don't think there's enough there yet to say like, hey, he's got the support to have a truly, a real breakout season. Interestingly, also receiving votes here is Rudy Gobert. We'll get back to that in a minute, but he was actually under also receiving votes. I don't know how a 3-time defensive player of the year and 3-time all-star is under most likely to have a breakout season, but that's where we're at. The one other Anthony Edwards mention was under most athletic player. Again, not a surprise. Maybe a little bit of a surprise that he's third on this list. Well, I should say, where'd he go? I thought he was third on the list. I lost it. I think he's third on the list. There it is. Yeah, he's third on the list. So John Morant is first. Giannis is second. Anthony Edwards is a relatively distant third. So 38% of the vote to John Morant for most athletic player, 31% to Giannis, and then 21% for Anthony Edwards. Zion still gets 7% at fourth, and LeBron still got a vote and landed at fifth for most athletic player in the league. Last year, Zion won that vote, which kind of surprises me. I guess he was coming off an exciting end to the season prior, but Edwards is third on the most athletic list, so I get that. That makes sense to me. Not a surprise. The next player to talk about is Rudy Gobert. Rudy Gobert is listed 5 different times in this survey. We talked about him as tied for, well, I guess this goes along with the other conversation that we had earlier in the podcast, but Gobert was tied for the best offseason acquisition. He was also listed as under other for underrated acquisition. Or I should rephrase that. He wasn't second so the best overall moves, the Timberwolves were tied for second. Rudy was listed as second as the one player acquisition that will make the biggest impact on their team. So Donovan Mitchell was first at 59%. Rudy Gobert got second with 31%. Jalen Brunson third at 7%. PJ Tucker fourth at 3%. Rudy, this makes a lot of sense to me. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. I think Cleveland may have a bigger win total improvement because they have a little bit further to go. They had some of those injuries last year, and had a couple of rough stretches after a really great start. So I could buy them having a bigger gap in terms of win total improvement. And Donovan Mitchell is going to help spur that. And then Rudy being second, sure. 31%, a pretty clear second place in that voting, clearly ahead of third place Brunson. So I get that. I'm on board with that. It makes sense. I understand why Cleveland's first. Rudy's also mentioned under underrated acquisition, as I said a little bit ago. Or I guess I said he was rated under other for breakout season, which is nuts to me because he's won 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards as a 3-time All-Star, has made All NBA teams. I don't know how you suddenly have a breakout unless somebody thinks he's going to go from like a top 20 player to like a top 5 player. I don't know how that happens with Rudy's game at age 30, but who knows? And then the other Rudy note here was most underrated player acquisition under other receiving votes. So one team voted Rudy as the most underrated player acquisition, which I thought was interesting. And then also he's mentioned, of course, under all the defensive categories. So under best defensive player in the NBA, Giannis is number one at 48%. Draymond Green number two still at 24%. Rudy number three at 10%, which is likely 3 votes with the way the each vote is roughly 3.5%. So rounding up to 10%. So 3 teams voted Rudy as the best overall defensive player in the league. Players received single votes: Adebayo, Drew Holiday, Kawhi Leonard, Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons still received a vote. Andrew Wiggins received a vote for best defensive player in the league. Giannis, for the second year in a row, wins the voting. Rudy is third at 10%. I probably would say he's second to Giannis and ahead of Draymond Green at this point in time, but it's whatever. Best interior defender in the NBA, Rudy easily wins that, 83%, which means that all but 5 teams, so 25 of the 30 teams, voted Rudy as the best interior defender in the NBA. Again, I don't think anyone can get 100% because I don't think you can vote for your own player. So likely the Timberwolves front office voted for Giannis or Draymond Green. Giannis got 10%, which is 3 votes. Draymond got 7%, which is 2 votes for best interior defender. So Rudy wins that voting, 25 out of 30 teams, 83% of votes. And last year, he won that category too, with 77% of the vote. Okay, we'll close the show. I want to talk about Chris Finch and also somebody who we haven't talked about that didn't hit any of these survey lists, and then some surprising results on some categories that I thought maybe the Wolves could get some mentions. I just thought that the where they landed was really interesting. All right, let's close out the NBA GM survey conversation with a little Chris Finch action. So, Chris Finch pops up twice on this survey. Now, we all know that Chris Finch is well respected. Prior to becoming a head coach, he every year pretty much was, at least for the 5 or so years prior to coming to Minnesota. There's also a question here that's who's the best assistant coach in the league, and almost every year Chris Finch was on there. He ranked highly. Front offices think highly of Chris Finch. He'd interviewed for a ton of jobs before the Wolves hired him. And that comes through in this survey. He's listed in the which head coach makes the best in-game adjustments question. Ty Lue won that one going away, 55% of the vote. Nick Nurse and Eric Spoelstra tied for second with 17% each. Chris Finch was among the others receiving votes, along with Rick Carlisle and Jason Kidd. So some really good company there for Chris Finch for best in-game adjustments. I think certainly that's been the case. Finch has had those moments. I don't know that I would have voted him as the best in the league in that category. Because I think there were some things that, plus just in general game management things that, his first full year as a head coach last year were nitpicking, but things that like you can kind of tell took a little bit to come around. And clearly game to game, Finch makes great adjustments. And I wonder if this is kind of the next thing, is like, then that becomes something that is more prevalent in game versus just game to game. So nice to see him get a vote there. And then which head coach runs the best offense? Steve Kerr wins that one going away, 62%. And then Chris Finch second with 14%, which, what do we say? That's I think that's 4 votes is 14%. Mike Budenholzer of the Bucks and Nick Nurse of the Raptors both tied for third with 7%. Carlisle Taylor Jenkins with the Grizzlies, interestingly enough, and Monty Williams with Phoenix also received votes for best offense. But Chris Finch is second. And I think that's really interesting too, because in my mind, it's more about the possibilities in Chris Finch's offense because of all the different things he has done. There were times last year where it wasn't all that creative, but it also doesn't need to be when your talent is that great. Remember, he always talks about putting up bumpers to let the players kind of figure it out within the parameters of the offense. And generally, I think that's what the Wolves do. And I guess choosing to run less of a structured offense is also part of this, right? It's part of having a good offense or a not so good offense if it doesn't work. So it'll be interesting to see what this looks like. I think this year, what the Wolves are going to obviously play fast, but with Rudy as a trailer in a lot of cases, what does the secondary break look like for the Wolves? What are those secondary actions coming out of transition? And how much pick and roll do they add back in? Because they did less of it last year than they did under Ryan Saunders, but with D'Lo and Rudy, especially if Towns isn't on the floor, that's what you're doing. How many horn sets do they run with Towns popping and Gobert diving to the rim? How much, does Towns still get mid-post touches like he did a bunch last year? So I think this is really interesting, but in my mind, it makes sense because it's because Finch allows his team so much leeway within the bumpers, but also there's a lot of possibilities because he has run pretty much everything. It's not like, hey, Rick Adelman's fantastic, but like, hey, I'm Rick Adelman, here's what I run. Or a better example would be, hey, I'm Phil Jackson or one of Phil Jackson's assistants, Kurt Rambis, whoever. This is what I run, right? It's adapting to the personnel, saying like, oh, you know what? I did this in New Orleans. I did this in Toronto. I did this in Memphis. Um, and or when I was in the Rockets organization, and being able to pull on these different things, try things based on personnel. In that sense, it's a little bit more Greg Popovich-y in my mind, or Popovich-ish, whichever extension to the name Popovich you prefer. Uh, which is obviously a very good thing. Pop is one of the best coaches of all time in any sport. So I don't know. I think it's really cool to see him second on this list. Steve Kerr being first, I get that too. So yeah, good for Finch. Okay, last thing. No Karl-Anthony Towns mentions, which I don't know this for sure. I'd have to go way back in time. I think this may be the first year we've seen him not mentioned at all. It used to be, player you'd start a team with. Breakout season is a big one. Those are probably the two, but he was always on the list somewhere. No Karl-Anthony Towns mentioned. Obviously, no D'Angelo Russell mentioned this year. So it's restricted to Ant, Rudy Gobert, Chris Finch, and the team as a whole. So I thought that was a little bit interesting, at least. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was some surprises. The Timberwolves didn't get any votes for the question related to the best young core, which maybe should, or the most promising young core. Shouldn't be surprised because Towns and D'Lo are both now, 27, 28. They're in their prime. Rudy's 30. So Ant is the young core. I mean, unless you want to include Jaden McDaniels. So like you could say Ant, Jaden McDaniels, maybe Jalen Noel. People really like their draft. I mean, you could make the argument. But then you look at some of the teams on the list and it's like, okay, I get it. Cleveland number 1 at 41%. Obviously, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland, like the amount of youth that they have. Now, Donovan Mitchell now is pretty close to Towns' D'Lo age. I think he might be 26, 27. But Jared Allen's in that same vicinity. So they're not ultra young, but I think it's more just they don't have anybody that's like that 30 and up. Like D'Lo, Cat, Rudy are all just a little bit older. Memphis at 38%. I guess I buy that. In addition to John Morant, you got Jaren Jackson Jr., I guess would be the other one. But I mean, like Desmond Bane's already 24 this year, and like everybody else, Brandon Clark's 26. Like everybody else is late 20s or older. So not an ultra young core beyond Ja and Jaren Jackson Jr. They're second in voting. Pistons third. Cart before the horse just a little bit, but I understand it. Others receiving votes: Pelicans, Thunder, Magic. The Pelicans really aren't that young besides Zion, so I don't like CJ McCollum's not young. Brandon Ingram is, again, like similar age to Cat at this point. And then the Magic are on there for others receiving votes as well. I think a lot of people really like Paolo Banchero, which is the primary reason why you're going to see them there. The other one that was a bit surprising was any player to start a franchise, not because there weren't any Wolves mentioned, but because there were only 2 players mentioned at all, which usually there's quite a few. If you probably guessed the 2, right? Giannis got 55% of the vote. Luka Doncic got 45%. Also, what was interesting to me is that last year Luka won this vote with only 43%, which means that 40% or less of people last year would have started with Giannis. But then after last season, they picked him as, if you could start a franchise today and sign any player, who would it be? Giannis gets 55%, Luka second with 45%. So a bit surprising to me. No Jokic, love, no Evan Mobley, no Anthony Edwards. Like the thought here was like, these guys are already superstars and they're still relatively young. And I, that makes sense. But I just thought it was really interesting that there wasn't like everybody of 30 GMs. They all said one of 2 people. It wasn't like you didn't have 6 different answers, which is kind of what I would have expected. But at any rate, if you haven't checked it out, go check it out at NBA.com. John Schumann does a great job with everything he does at NBA.com. I say this during the season when we do power rankings. His power rankings are the best ones by far of any site out there. So go check out everything John Schumann does at NBA.com. But the NBA GM survey is a fantastic read. So go read that when you get a chance. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, we're available anywhere you listen to podcasts. That includes YouTube. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. You can also download the new Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7. It's absolutely free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Programming note, of course, we'll have a show Friday. It will be the post-game pod. It'll post Friday morning following the late Wolves game on Thursday. It's on ESPN at the Lakers on a neutral site court in Vegas. Wolves Lakers at 9 p.m. So we'll do a post-game pod, a bit more of a built-out post-game pod on Friday than we did earlier this week. And that'll be and then we'll look ahead to next week. Tons more preseason action for the Wolves, perhaps. Towns sees the floor next week. So we'll talk about all that as well. Reminder that, of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Reminder that you can make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball. The fantastic Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.